There is a night that every Amish young man remembers. Not the morning Rumspringa begins, not the first Sunday singing, not the first time he touches a phone or sits in a car without his father watching from the window. Those memories come later, and they are the ones he might eventually talk about, the ones that make for a good story at the right kind of table. The night I am talking about comes before all of that, the one that happens in the quiet just before the beginning, the one that was never described to anyone on the outside, the one that you understood, without anyone ever speaking the oath out loud, that you would carry to your grave. Most people think Rumspringa is something that simply begins. The calendar turns, you cross a certain age, and the leash comes off. That is the picture the documentaries painted. That is what most people on the outside believe. What they don't know is that in the communities I grew up in, there was a moment before the beginning, a gathering, a private conversation, an elder sitting across from you in a room lit by a single kerosene lamp, looking you in the eyes and saying the things that are never, ever supposed to leave that room. My name is Jacob. I grew up Old Order Amish. I was baptized into the church. I knelt on the wooden floor of a neighbor's house and gave myself to the only life I had ever known. And then some years later, I walked away from it. This channel is where I say the things I was raised to keep behind the barn door. Tonight, I want to talk about that night, the private instruction they give the young men the night before Rumspringa begins, the words that get said in the lamplight and the quiet and the hay smell of a barn in the evening, the words that nobody outside has ever been told about in full. I want to say first, as I always do, that I am not here to build a case against anyone. The men who sat across from me that night were not cruel people. My grandfather was there, my uncle, two men from the district whose names I won't say, men who had known me since before I could walk, men I respected deeply and still respect. In the complicated way you come to respect people who shaped you. What they told me that night they believed completely. They believed every word. That is the thing that makes it worth saying out loud. Not that bad men said dangerous things to a boy, but that good men did and meant every syllable as a gift. Let me tell you how the night went. It was the late evening before my running around years were to begin. I was 16. In our district, this conversation happened in the barn rather than the house. I came to understand why later, and I will say something about it. And there were 4 older men and my father and me. The barn smelled the way barns always smell in the evening. Hay and harness leather, and the particular cold that lives underneath those smells in any season. There was a lamp on the old workbench, and it made a yellow circle in all of that dark, and outside the circle the rafters disappeared. The men sat on overturned crates and on bales, and my father sat closest to me, and nobody rushed into the talking. That is the Amish way with serious things. You let the silence settle first. You let it do its work. You let the room become itself before anyone speaks into it. I remember sitting there and thinking I was about to receive a warning, something practical about the world outside, some piece of wisdom about the temptations I would face and how to hold myself against them. What I received was more complicated than any warning. It was a set of instructions, carefully assembled, wrapped in genuine love, and it took me years on the outside to understand the full shape of what had been placed inside me that night, in the lamplight and the quiet, by men who never imagined I would one day describe it to anyone. My grandfather spoke first, and he spoke in Pennsylvania Dutch, the way the important things were always said in our house. He said that what lay ahead of me was a time I had earned, a time to look at the world and to look at my own heart. And then he said something I have turned over in my mind almost every week since. He said the world outside will try to give you things, and some of those things will feel good, and your only job, the only thing that matters in this time, is to see those things clearly for what they are. Because a thing that feels good in the hand is not the same as a thing that is good. A young man who cannot tell the difference has already begun to lose his way. That was the opening. It was wise. I mean that honestly. It was genuine wisdom, earned wisdom, the kind of thing an old man learns through decades of watching people make choices and living with the consequences. But it was also something else, and I only understood the something else much later, after I had left and had enough distance to see the whole evening from the outside. Here is what was really happening in that barn, whether the men in it understood it that way or not. Rumspringa is described from the outside as a gift of freedom. We give you this time to see the world, they say, so that when you choose the church, you choose it with open eyes. That is what gets said, and it is said sincerely. But the night before talk was, underneath every kind word, a tutorial on how to fail the test correctly. I use the word test deliberately because that is what Rumspringa was for the community around me, a test, the result of which would determine the rest of my life. And almost nothing about how the men spoke to me that night was about freedom. Almost everything was about the shape of a leash that would remain in place, even while everyone in that barn called it freedom. Let me tell you the specific things that were said. The first instruction was about the body and what it remembers. They used careful language. They were not crude men, but the meaning arrived clearly. Some experiences, once entered, change the person who enters them in ways that cannot be undone. The elders named no specifics because they didn't need to. Every 16-year-old Amish boy already knew what they meant. The message was not simply, do not do these things. The message was, if you do these things, you will have made yourself different from who you were, and different in ways that make coming back harder. That phrase, coming back, appeared again and again throughout the conversation, and I noticed it even then, though I couldn't have told you why it bothered me. I was not yet gone. I was sitting in the barn where I had done my chores every day of my life, and the whole conversation was already about the return. That is the first thing they never tell anyone outside. The night before Rumspringa, the word the elders say the most is not freedom. It is return. The second instruction was about being seen. They told me to be careful about who saw me and where and in what company. In particular, they said to be careful about being observed by people from other communities, other districts, anyone who might carry word back. They said this the way a father says it about reputation. Don't embarrass yourself. Don't embarrass the family. And that is probably how they meant it. But what it meant in practice was something specific. It meant that the community would still be watching during Rumspringa. Even in the period that is supposed to exist outside the church's discipline, the eyes of the community remained on you, through cousins, through neighbors, through the slow and thorough network of people who knew your grandfather's name and kept their own accounting of what they saw. You were never, in any practical sense, unseen. The freedom was real in some ways. But it was a freedom that was watched, and the watching was continuous, and everyone in that barn understood this, and none of them said it in those terms, because it didn't need to be said plainly. It was understood the way the most important things in that world were always understood, not through words, but through the air between them. The third instruction is the one I have wanted to talk about the longest. They spoke about the ones who don't come back, not by name, or not by names I recognized as belonging to living people, though I knew there were names they were thinking of. They spoke about the type, the kind of young man who goes out and does not find his way home, the kind who lets the outside get into him too deep, who comes back different, or who does not come back at all. And the word they used for such a young man was not wicked. It was not even sinful. The word was lost. He got lost out there. He wandered too far and couldn't find his way home. The language of lostness. I have turned that word over in my mind for years because it does a very specific thing. Lost implies an accident. Lost implies that the young man intended to come home and simply couldn't locate the road. Lost does not imply that a person looked carefully at both paths and made a considered choice about which one fit the shape of who he actually was. Lost removes the intention from the person who walked away. It turns a departure into a tragedy, a fog that descended on an otherwise good young man and carried him off. And that framing, once I could see it, is itself an instruction, delivered so naturally that it doesn't feel like instruction at all. It feels like sorrow. It feels like worry. And worry is much harder to resist than a commandment. If leaving is lostness, then anyone who has left is not someone who exercised a real choice. He is someone the community is supposed to grieve and pray for, the same way you grieve and pray for a man who wandered into the woods and didn't return by dark. And what do you do for such a man? You keep the light on. You wait at the window. You do not follow him into the trees. You do not wonder whether the direction he was walking might have been intentional. You stand at the edge of the tree line and hope, and the hope is itself a kind of fence, built not of condemnation, but of love, which is the most effective kind of fence there is. I need to stop for a moment because this video goes somewhere heavy, and if you are still with me, that means something. If any of this is landing, if you were ever handed a kind of freedom with a leash attached and told the leash was there to protect you, do me a favor and subscribe. This is where I keep telling the truth I was raised to swallow. I am going to keep going. And tell me in the comments, did you ever receive a warning wrapped in care that was really a cage? Amish or not, I read every one of them. Now let me tell you about the unspoken rules, because there were spoken instructions that night, and then there was everything that moved between the words. The first unspoken rule was this: there is a version of Rumspringa that the community finds acceptable, and a version that it does not, and by the time you are sitting in that barn, the community has already formed an expectation of which version it will be getting from you. The acceptable version looks like this. You socialize with other Amish young people. You attend the Sunday singings. You gather on weekend evenings at someone's farm. You test the edges in ways that are, effectively, permitted experiments, low stakes, reversible, the kind of straying that a young man can confess in the spring and have forgiven by summer without anyone looking at him differently for the rest of his life. Maybe you rode in a car more than you should have. Maybe you listened to music you weren't supposed to. The acceptable version has a known shape, and the shape leaves room to come home clean. The unacceptable version is where you start to want something permanent, where the outside world begins to feel not like a temptation you are supposed to survive, but like a home you were supposed to be living in all along. Nobody described that distinction out loud. Nobody drew the map, but the shape of the acceptable version was there in every sentence the elders spoke, in every word chosen and every word not chosen, and I absorbed it the way I had absorbed everything in that world, through the body, through nearness, through the feeling of a room that already knew what it expected of me. The second unspoken rule was that the community was counting, not counting down to a deadline the way a parent counts to bedtime, counting in the way a community tracks who it can still trust. Every step you took during your running around years was being observed and held in the quiet memory of the people who loved you, not with suspicion, not with cruelty, but with the steady attention of people who had invested their whole hope for your future in your eventual return. You were not free in Rumspringa. You were on a long, careful loan. And loans come due in that world the same as in any other. The third unspoken rule was the heaviest, and it is the one I think the elders themselves may never have found words for, even in private. The further you went, the harder the road back would be. And the harder the road back became, the more your failure to take it would look like a choice instead of an accident. The community can hold a son who got lost. It cannot hold nearly as well a son who looked at the lamplight in the barn window and made the clear-eyed decision to keep walking. The only version of your departure the community can absorb without fracturing is the accidental version. And so the unspoken rule was about distance. Don't go so far that your not returning looks like something you meant. Because if it looks intentional, it becomes a different kind of grief and a different kind of judgment than lostness is. All of that moved through the air in the barn that night. None of it said, all of it received. I absorbed it the way I had always absorbed the most important things in that world, below the level of argument, in the body, in the chest, in the place where feelings live before they become thoughts. And by the time the lamp was turned down and the men walked back toward the house, and my father put his hand on my shoulder in the dark outside the barn door and said what he said to me, the one true private thing that existed between only the two of us that night, the weight was already installed. Rumspringa had not yet begun, and I was already carrying the instructions for how to come home from it. Here is what I want to say most carefully, because it is the part that closes the whole shape of that night. The private talk the night before is not primarily about protecting you from the world. I believed that for years. I needed to believe it because it made the love in it legible. But I have lived long enough outside that barn to understand what the function of that gathering actually was, whether the men in it knew it or not. The function was this: to install the weight that makes freedom feel dangerous, to make sure that even in the season when the leash is nominally off, the young man's own heart supplies the tension the leash was providing. And the reason it happens in the barn instead of the house, the reason it happens in the dark, in the lamp circle, in the smell of hay and cold leather, is that things said in that kind of quiet go somewhere deeper than argument. They become feeling, they become gravity, they become the voice in your chest that has no sentence attached to it, only weight, only the sense of something pulling you back from an edge you haven't even found yet. And it works. I can speak to how well it works because I am someone it nearly worked on completely, someone who stood at the edge of his own Rumspringa and then at the edge of baptism and said yes to the church and meant it because the weight in his chest said yes before his mind had ever had the conversation. The private talk the night before is, in the most honest terms I can find, an act of love that is also an act of installation. And I do not say that to wound the men who sat across from me in that lamplight. I say it because it is the truth, and because the boy in that barn deserved, somewhere along the way, to know that it was also that. I have been in the outside world long enough now to have met people who received versions of the same transmission from very different sources. Other families, other religions, other tight communities, where belonging was the whole world and leaving was described as a kind of wandering. The lamp is always different, the words are always different. The barn is sometimes a kitchen, sometimes a church office, sometimes a back pew after services. But the shape of what gets passed across the table tends to be the same. You are loved and you are needed, and we are frightened of losing you. And because we cannot say the frightened part plainly, we say the love part very carefully and hope the weight of it holds you in place. Most of the time it does. I am one of the ones it didn't hold in the end, and the life I have built on the other side is a real one, not a cautionary tale, not a tragedy, not the blizzard those men were describing when they talked about lostness. I work. I have people who know me. I wake up in the morning inside a world I am allowed to ask questions about out loud, and nobody receives the questions as betrayal. I do not say that to wound the people I came from. I say it because the boy sitting in the barn that night, listening to the weight being placed inside him, deserved to know that the other side of the snow was survivable. Nobody told him that. Nobody in that barn had ever made it far enough to find out. If you have ever sat in a room, a barn, a living room, a back office, anywhere, and received a version of that talk, the one that loved you and waited you and installed something in your chest, all in the same evening, and called all of it protection, then I want you to know that what was done to you was not done in cruelty. It was done by people who were carrying the same weight and had been taught that love looked like passing it forward. You are allowed to put it down. You are allowed to walk into the snow and find that it is not the blizzard you were warned about. You are allowed to build a life on the other side and call it home, without calling the people who warned you your enemies, because they were not your enemies. They were frightened and sincere, and they did not know how to do any of this differently because no one had ever shown them another way. The men in that barn are not lost either. They are held by the same things they used to hold me. They are good and loving and frightened, and they cannot see the outside of the system they are standing inside of. I do not spend my life in anger at them. I spend whatever I have on trying to describe from the outside what they cannot describe from within. That is why I keep coming back to this channel. That is why I am still talking. There are things about that specific night that I could not put in a video like this. The conversation I was not supposed to hear between two of the older men when they stepped outside for a moment and didn't know I was close enough to the wall to catch the words. The thing my father said to me in the dark outside the barn door. The one real private thing that wasn't about the community. The one moment that existed only between the two of us. The full account of what came after Rumspringa and what the road out actually looked like, step by step. I wrote all of it down. The things that would not survive on a platform like this one, the names changed, the pages of that unwritten life as I actually lived it, are in the book. You will find it linked in the description and pinned in the first comment. Subscribe because I am not finished pulling the door open on the world I came from. I will keep doing it gently, honestly, and without ever forgetting that the men in that barn are still mine, even on the days when I will never be entirely theirs again. Until next time, the weight that was placed in your chest was not yours to begin with, but deciding what to do with it is. That is the one freedom nobody installed in me that night in the lamplight. It was the one I had to find entirely on my own.